Hey guys, it's Jesse from Mullen Woodworks. Today I'm going to go over how to make this poplar and epoxy chessboard. It's a lot easier than you would think, and I'm going to go over all the steps so you can complete one for yourself. Stay tuned. Sponsor of this video is Moss Epoxies. Make sure that you check them out if you have any epoxy needs, whether it's a tabletop epoxy or whether it's a deep pour epoxy like pouring a river table. Make sure that you check out their website at www.mossepoxies.com and follow them on Instagram. So I start by cutting down the poplar to the rough sizes. I don't have a joiner, so I use my joiner jig to start milling out this rough lumber. I use poplar just because it's on the cheaper end of hardwood, but it also has quite a bit of character once you get finish on it. So I had to cut 8 2¼ inch wide strips. Now these will be the strips for the cutting board. I had to mill them out into different thicknesses. 4 would be about 3/4 inch thick, and the other ones would be just over a 1/2 inch thick. Looking back, I wish I had milled out the thinner boards into even thinner pieces, so instead of closer to a 1/2 inch, maybe even less than that, just so that I could pour more epoxy in between. As you can see, I'm rotating between the two for glue up, and after that I just go through, clamp them together, and wait till they're dry. While I'm gluing this up, I'll let you guys know that there are links to the tools I use in the description, so make sure you check that out. Also hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, and like the video. So once it's glued up, I go through and now I cut it the other direction. So I first cut off the little excess pieces just to make sure it was square. Then I ran that along my fence and cut into 8 strips again. Now I'll be rotating them back and forth to make sure that I get that checkerboard or chessboard pattern. As you can see now, I am going through and gluing up the pieces the other direction. Where the pieces are thinner, that's where I'll be pouring the epoxy, and I'll pour them to the level surface of the thicker pieces and then just sand it down. Now instead of screwing the chessboard once it was glued to a basically a taped board so I can pour the epoxy, I just left it in the clamps and then made these little walls with Tyvek tape on them so the epoxy wouldn't stick, and that's what I used to pour the epoxy and make sure it didn't run out the sides. So I'm using Moss Epoxy Flag. It's the medium viscosity. It worked really well, and I just used the 2-in-1 pumps, which was awesome. And I used a black diamond pigment, so I mixed a little bit of blue and a little bit of black pigment and started pouring. So as you can see that some of the pockets weren't deep enough, so they were overflowing quite a bit. I would definitely make sure that you do a bigger discrepancy on the thicknesses of the board, and that's just because when I started routing it out, which is this next step, I actually routed too far down, and it ended up having to go back and fix some of the pieces and re-pour about 5 of the squares. So if you have a bigger discrepancy between the 2 thicknesses, you shouldn't run into that. I'm using a bit I got from Tools Today. It's a slab flattening bit. I'm just using that to make sure it gets it completely flat. I did try to just sand it right away, but there's too much overflow and it would have taken me forever. So I decided to do it this way. Here I'm going through and routing out some of the pieces that there were 5 squares that weren't deep enough, and actually wood was showing through because the epoxy wasn't deep enough after I flattened it. So I went through and I routed out, and I was really careful with a 1/8 inch straight bit, and did the squares and rerouted everything. Also, you can kind of see some chip out in the other squares. I had to go back and I had to paint basically some epoxy in and fill out any of the chip out in any of the other squares as well. So I went through after they were all routed out and I poured the epoxy. Put a little too much black in this one, so these squares are just slightly darker than the others, but it wasn't too bad, and it kind of makes it not uniform, which is kind of cool because it adds a little bit more character. After those were dry, I went through, I cut off some really bad chip out on one end, and then I went through and sanded. Spent a lot of time sanding and sanding and sanding. Step was to make the frame, so I started milling out poplar. I planed it down to the thickness I wanted, and then I cut the pieces to the width that I wanted as well. Then cut a channel on the top side of each piece of the frame so I could pour a little epoxy and give it a little bit more character. After that was all glued up, I went through and I poured the epoxy into the channel. It was a lot of fun, but definitely be patient because you don't want to over pour and have to keep going and sanding more and more. But I had to do it quite a few passes because you get a lot of bubbles that come up, and so I used my heat gun to try to pull those bubbles to the top and get those bubbles out of there. After the epoxy cured and was sanded down, I went through and I put a chamfered edge along the entire frame. Then branded the side with my torch heated branding iron and started putting on the finish. I use General Finish's Armor Seal, which I absolutely love. It's by far my favorite finish, and it makes the epoxy pop. One of the funnest projects I've ever done. It was a lot simpler than I pictured in my head once I really got into it. There's so many things you can do with different types of wood, with different pigments and the epoxy. So there's hundreds of different combinations you can do, you can try out. So make sure that you tag me if you do make one. Send me a message, I'd love to see it. And make sure you follow me on Instagram and Facebook and also here on YouTube. Thanks.